Well, hi, Professor Taylor.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us here at SEPA. We're delighted to have you.
I'm glad to be here.
So we're very excited about your new book, The Politics of Innovation, and it's very timely for us here at SEPA because we've recently launched a new initiative funded by the NASDAQ Foundation to really think about the intersection of policy, innovation, and technology. So let's jump right in there. You mentioned in the book that this is a project that you began thinking about in 2001. How did you sort of get interested in this area?
So I guess it goes way back before then. I started out, I guess, my academic life as a physicist back during the 80s. And I graduated right at the time when the Cold War was coming to an end. So they didn't need any physicists anymore. And right at the same time, Japan was the next big thing in science and technology, in the same way that China sort of is seen as this next big competitor today. And this really struck me as odd because Japan seemed to come from nowhere. There were much more likely countries to be our competitors, like France, which had 200 years of advanced science and technology, very wealthy, was inside of the European trade area, lots of support from the United States. So why was Japan the next big thing and not France? So I went to study and work in Japan for a year or two, and then came back right into the middle of the 1991 recession, 91-92 recession, couldn't get a job. So I realized this international affairs stuff, that matters more than I thought it did. Because when I was growing up, I was told if you study science, get a degree in physics, the sky's the limit. And this was twice where I tried to go in the job market and was getting hit by things going on in international affairs. So that's when I realized, okay, this is interesting. So I went to get a master's in international affairs where I did a specialty in science and technology. And then went to work corporate for a few years, and then came back to get a PhD in international relations, political science, international relations, once again with a focus on this question. So I've sort of been thinking about this issue all the way back to my days as an undergraduate.
Wow, there's a lot there. Here at SEPA, we're trying to build out sort of a tech and policy initiative and think about what is the skill set at the intersection of science, technology, and public policy that we need to be training the next generation of scholars for.
Wow. So I think basically there's the whole tool set. Innovation has gone from a small subfield within economics to this huge academic think tank industry that scales academia. There are economists, sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, tons of business scholars, only a few political scientists, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book. In fact, one of the motivations behind the book was if I was going to teach a class for a semester on this topic that I've been studying now for 25 years, and I could only assign one book, what would that book be? And it didn't exist. So the book is actually a great introduction for people wanting to get at this field because it surveys all the theories, all the major theories, and data sources and methods in which my own research is sort of woven in. So I've got a lot of original points in the book, but it's also a great survey piece. So both newcomers or people who only know a particular subset of this debate can pick at the book and find good stuff.
Great. I'm going to assign it in my course that I teach in the spring.
Even there's a few short, hopefully fun appendices which get into things like what do we mean by innovation? Because economists mean something different by the word than, say, sociologists or political scientists. Sometimes the same economists will mean different things in different articles. So nailing down the language can just be tough. And it's changed over time. Technology is a relatively new term. So there are some sections on that. Data, how do you measure innovation? There are all sorts of different ways. And there's even a section on sources. So if people want to try to get into this themselves, this will start them on the trail to sources of patent data or publication data or case studies and different ways of approaching the subject.
And so for SEPA students sort of really engaged in public policy, how do you think your theory of creative instability relates to them and to the different fields they may want to go work in?
So there are lots of different points that I'm trying to get through in the book. And one of them sort of is targeted at economists who have long been the traditional innovation scholars. That's sort of where it comes out of, at least in the American tradition. And when economists encounter innovation, they see what's called a market failure problem. And their response is always an institution. So for example, if you were to invent the cure for the common cold, right? I could copy that pretty easily, start my own company for marketing that, for selling that drug, and I could make all the money where you had spent all the time and the risk and the resources to invent this thing. So in order to protect that market failure, the government has come up with something called a patent, which protects your rights for about 17 years these days, so that you've got time to go make back the investment you put in and hopefully some profit. And this will incentivize people to innovate. Otherwise, they go, why should I do research when someone else could just copy it? And these types of market failures plague innovation. And whenever economists or political scientists hear of market failure, they go, come up with an institution, like a patent or a subsidy or what have you, to solve this. And so they see it as a domestic issue with institutions and policies as the answer. This book says, no, there's other stuff going on. That if you just look at the institutions and the policies, it doesn't explain anything. There are lots of countries with great institutions and policies that don't innovate a whole lot. And there are a handful of countries with terrible institutions and policies, but who innovate very well. So this book takes looks at these successes in comparison to the failures and says there's other stuff going on. First, there's not just institutions and policies, but social networks matter. So governments that pay attention to social networks do very well in innovation. And these social networks are not just domestic, they're also international. So again, the traditional approach to innovation is to think of it as this is a domestic problem. It's not. It's an international problem with international solutions. So these are two points that I want to make to scholars and policy makers, and hopefully voters as well, that the international matters and networks matter. And there's sort of another major point, which is that people's sense of security matter. Innovation can be very threatening. It threatens industries, it threatens jobs, it threatens resources. And every dollar you spend on science and technology is a dollar you're not spending on welfare, on infrastructure, on tax breaks, or in corrupt countries, money lining elite pockets. So it's not a no-brainer to spend money on science and technology. There are people fighting for those dollars. So if countries have a lot of internal divisions where the different groups and interest groups sort of see each other as the enemy, they're not going to innovate a lot. They're not going to want to take the risks or spend the money. They're going to fight over that. But if there's a large sense of external threat, whether it's military, like in the case of Israel, or economic, like in the case, say, of Ireland, then you will get a lot of investment in science and technology. So it's that balance of threat and the politics around those that determine what goes on. And that's sort of another point in there. So there's a lot going on in this book. So
yeah, and I think, two related questions. One about the current political climate in the U.S. and we're seeing this election. Sort of, how are you, from your vantage point, watching this election?
So it's dreadful from my perspective because Americans are now beginning to see each other as the enemy and competing against one another. And we see it in the budgets. Congress has not been able to pass a budget in I don't know how many years. That's because everyone is fighting over the dollars being spent, what they should be spent on, or should it just be given back to us? And people who see dollars spent on this or that technology say, no, I'm not going to benefit from that. That's a waste of my money. Or basic research. A lot of basic research is very risky. There are a lot of failures. So people don't want to risk their tax dollars on that. So we are not performing as well in science, especially basic science, as we were 20 years ago. And you can see this in the data. You can see this in publications, in new discoveries, in inventions going out into the market. We see this in the data going down, down, down. And that's problematic because basic science is one area where a lot of the next generation's cutting edge products and services are going to come from.
And so when you think about that, contrasted to the idea of Silicon Valley, and you talk a lot about the social networks in your book, there's always this idea of can you recreate what happened in Silicon Valley? And it's something we at Columbia think about being in New York, being here, in Tech Alley, trying to really think about what's the potential of a city like New York to emerge in respect to innovation as an entrepreneurial state. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes and no. Yes, I think any country, state, city can create an innovative hub, but you don't do it by copying Silicon Valley. And this is one of the, I think, one of the positive revelations of the book is I looked at all sorts of different cases of success. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Israel, Finland, amazing case of success, the US. They all have wildly different approaches to becoming innovative, very different sets of institutions and policies, some that are totally contradictory to one another. So what goes on in Japan is very different than what goes on in the United States. So the good news is countries get to pick and choose. You can design institutions and policies that fit your politics, your history, your culture, your traditions. The Chinese don't have to copy the US or Japan in order to become innovative. You do have to solve the market failures. You do have to set up the social networks. And you do have to manage the politics. You need to convince the taxpayers to rally behind the expensive, risky investments and put up with the failures. One classic recent case is Solyndra, right? Which is a miserable failure. But when you're coming up with new science and technology, these failures happen all the time. It's painful to your average taxpayer, especially those who are trying to struggle to make ends meet, to look at that and say, wow, why is that worthwhile? But we need to come up with a better, better way, budget-wise, of funding this, but also politically, to have these discussions and keep going. Otherwise, we'll just keep fighting over the goodies, and we'll wind up killing the goose that lays the golden eggs.
I think one of the challenges is the question of how these benefits trickle down, right? And so who wins, who are the winners and the losers? I was recently out in Seattle, and you're seeing a city that's sort of booming, but inequality is on the rise.
Right.
So sort of the winners of these are not equal. How do you sort of think about that, and how should us from a policy perspective try to understand this?
So I don't address that in the book. It's a very difficult question, and it all depends upon where you sit. In the long run, we've seen that new technology creates new jobs. Right. But in the short run, industries go under, people lose their jobs. So what do? One answer is education and training, which has had some success. This is a difficult area that I haven't gotten into, so I don't have immediate answers.
It's a difficult question, and I think it's part of this nexus of policy, innovation, and technology that we're trying to grapple with here. I don't think there are clear-cut answers.
Right.
But we're trying to think about sort of what are the skill sets and the tools and sort of how do you think about even addressing this issue? It's like, how do you think about this?
Again, I believe in the whole tool set. So definitely we need to bring in all the social scientific methods to bear. And one problem in my own field is you get people who will only use statistical techniques or only use computer models or only use qualitative case studies. We need to bring them all together and see what they're coming up in common. We need to start running experiments in the different states in policy solutions to address these problems. We need to be looking around the world for other solutions. I think, was it Finland has just begun to experiment with a basic income? Right? So we'll see, and there's lots of controversy about that. But testing these is useful because I know people both on the left and the right are very critical and suspicious of a basic income. But we need to test these and see what happens. If we just say, no, we're not going to try any of them, then miserable outcomes will occur.
I think it goes to your point of the interplay of domestic politics with the sort of internal innovation environment.
Right.
In your mind, what are the innovations that are occurring right now that maybe we don't currently understand the power of? Like you talk about the transistor in your book, about how people really didn't understand or grasp its potential for many decades. Are there similar things that you're seeing today or trends that you think may define the next few decades? Of course, it's hard to predict, but we won't hold you accountable for getting the future wrong.
It's impossible. Everyone, repeatedly, and I mentioned some of these in the book, great innovations are ignored, like jet propulsion originally. The transistor was something minor when it first was invented. Everyone thought the Segway was going to be amazing, and I don't know anyone riding now unless it's to tour a certain part of New York, right? I think virtual reality has the possibility of being transformational. I do think autonomous driving, which people I think is widely expected, as we get deeper into biotechnology and understanding the mechanics of the gene, that has fantastic possibilities. Right now, health scientists have been addressing longevity. I think we should be addressing quality of life. Wouldn't it be great to be 70 and have the same energy and vitality of a 40-year-old? And I think these are things that all Americans and all people everywhere could say, yeah, I'll invest some money on that. You can spend my tax dollars on that. So I think this is one area that policymakers and politicians could bring to the American people and say, this is what we want to invest your dollars on. And that could get good support.
Do you ever fear that all the innovations have already occurred?
No. There is a powerful book by the name, by an economist by the name of Robert Gordon, that has come out that has said that maybe we're at the end of the road of innovation, that the innovations of the last 20, 30 years, what's the joke? You know, on my cell phone, I now have access to the internet and all the knowledge of mankind across human history, and I use it to post videos of cute puppies, right? So what are we really using this stuff for? I disagree. Throughout history, there have been periods where people think it's the end of innovation. Right. But things that we're not even paying attention to, like the transistor then and who knows what now, become the thing that make us leap up forward.
You know, one of the things that I spend a lot of my time studying is innovation in governance. So how do we improve the institutions, the conditions of governance, engaging citizens? You know, curious if you have any thoughts based on your research on how we can sort of engage citizens in democracy, or sort of how those both external but also internally to government can try to leverage some of these innovations.
Right. So I'm a big fan of markets. The book is a lot about what governments can and should, or can't and shouldn't do. So I do believe there is a role for government to support markets. Or perhaps even take over if markets completely and utterly fail, which is rare, but it does happen. So I do believe that government needs to do what it can to make markets work and make them competitive. That's the point of markets, is that they're competitive. Can you bring the lessons we've learned in economics into policymaking? Right. So in budgeting, whether it's bringing in the citizens themselves or even the legislators, can you create a market where people can trade resources and create a budget out of that that will reflect not just preferences of the people in the legislatures, but give them a stake in making it happen? I think that's one problem with Congress, is no one really has a stake in getting a budget passed anymore, but just in embarrassing the opposite party by having it not pass. And that's a fundamental breakdown. And so we're sort of baby stepping towards bad things. If you can't pass a budget, that's a fundamental task of government. If you can't appoint judges and justices or ambassadors, that's a fundamental job of government. So it's bad signs that it keeps on getting worse and worse and worse over time. So can markets be brought in to do this? In the same way that we see we can use them to help out innovation in the technology world, can we use these kinds of innovations in the policy world?
I think that's useful, and I think, you know, your background in physics and having sort of this interplay of S&T with international affairs has, you know, served you well and created really important, interesting work. For, you know, SIPA students right now, if you were to say, you know, these are some of the skill sets that you might want to think about, what would they be?
I think methodology at the very top. And this can be social network analysis, statistics, computer modeling, GIS, how to get out there and conduct interviews and surveys, go into countries or industries and study them. I mean, you can't come up with policy solutions if you don't have data and good analytical skills. So those would be job one, I think.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. We were really excited about our speaker today. You want to put your book code up here. He's written a wonderful book that I really recommend called The Politics of Innovation. We'll return our copy back to the library after this, but moreover, here is a discount code. And you know, I really enjoyed this book, and it's a nascent field, and so it's really important to have rigorous scholarship that's done on innovation, and it's something that we're actively thinking about here at Columbia. You know, as Hugo mentioned, we're really thinking about tech and policy. Just this week, we announced a NASDAQ gift from their Education Foundation to really think about the intersection of entrepreneurship, innovation, and policy. You know, as anyone who's planned an event at SIPA knows, these events seem straightforward and they're very complicated. So just a few quick moments of thank you. Today's event is in collaboration with the Urban and Social Policy Program. the Saltzman Institute, and a big thank you to Ingrid and to Jackie for all of their help in getting to these event off the ground. Let's do a quick round of applause for those guys. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker, and he's going to present some of his really fascinating findings, and then we're going to open it up for what I'm sure will be a rich discussion. So our speaker today is a professor at Georgia Institute of Technology. He has a background as a physicist, and he really is a dynamic interdisciplinary scholar thinking about the relationship between science and technology and international affairs. So a perfect fit for some of the work we're trying to do at SEPA really across these areas. So without further ado, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you to the School of International Public Affairs and all their collaborators for having me here. So I'm Zach Taylor, currently at Georgia Institute of Technology. And for the past 25 years, I've been interested in this question: why are some countries better at science and technology than others? And as a subset, what can governments do about it, or can't do, or should or shouldn't do? And the motivation behind the book was that after 25 years, if I was going to teach a course on this subject that sort of surveyed all the research, including my own, but could only assign one book, what would that book look like? Because it didn't exist. So I tried to write that book. So for people who are new to this line of research, or who only know one part of it and want to see what's going on in general, this is a great way to get started and get into the subject. And for those of you who see the discount code, this is for the soft cover copy. If you really want to save money, my publisher was able to get the Kindle version down to $9. So have at it. So the book, Politics of Innovation: Why Are Some Countries Better Than Others at Science and Technology? Let's take a look at what we're trying to explain, which is this really messy slide right here. Don't worry, I'll clean it up in a second. Let me just show you what you're looking at. This is an attempt, just one attempt, to measure innovation rates of around the top 20 innovative countries, top 25 innovative countries around the world. We've got the years 1975 to 2005 on the bottom. The next few slides will broaden that out to 1970 to 2012. It was easier to clean up those than this one, so I left this one as it is. On the y-axis, we've got relative innovation rates. Now, there are a dozen different ways to measure innovation. For this slide and the remainder in this lecture, I'll just talk about patents. That's not the only measure I use. I use various quantitative measures. And for those of you who don't trust quantitative measures, in some sections of the book, I throw them out entirely and say, let's just look at case studies of industries, of countries at different times in different parts of the world. But here we're talking patents. Now, since larger countries obviously have more scientists and engineers and inventors than small countries, we want to control for population. So this isn't just patents, it's patents per capita. And obviously, all patents aren't the same. We don't want to treat the patent for the transistor the same as the patent for the self-twirling spaghetti fork, if you've ever seen that joke invention, right? The patent for the transistor has spurned entire industries. The patent for the self-twirling spaghetti fork helps you eat spaghetti once, then you throw it in a drawer because it's a gag gift and you never touch it again. So one way that researchers have found to control for the quality of inventions is to look at forward citations of the patent. When you apply for a patent, you have to cite prior art. So more revolutionary inventions, like the transistor, will have hundreds, if not thousands, of forward citations. The self-twirling spaghetti fork will have 0. In fact, something like half or most patents have 0 or 1 forward citation. So this is patents per capita weighted by forward citation. And then, because the United States is clearly the most innovative country in the world during this time period, I just made them all relative to the United States. So the US is number 1, right across the top right there. Everyone else is relative to the US. So now let's move forward. This is a mess. I was able to clean it up into 3 sort of subcategories. This are the world's most innovative countries consistently during this period. These are sort of the solid reliables. We see Japan in red, sort of coming up through the 70s when it's a mid-level innovator and vaunting up to the top, even getting better than the US, at least according to this measure, during some periods. We see Switzerland over here going into some relative decline, but still a solid innovative. Sweden Sweden in yellow. If you went back to earlier times, Sweden would be way up here. It used to be one of the most innovative countries in the world. Still is, just not as high as it used to be. Canada in dark blue, relatively flat but solid. Germany in green, again, relatively solid. So these are the world's top innovators. Keep your eye on this 0.2 line, arbitrarily chosen, but it's instructive because if you go to the world's mid-level innovators, everyone's below it. This is Netherlands, France, United Kingdom, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Austria, Australia, Ireland, Italy, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Spain. And what we notice about this group, and they're all innovative countries, they're just not as high as the others. They're all below that 0.2 line. We see a jump up with Netherlands. And I still have to go into the data to see if it's an artifact of this particular measure, whether something really changed here. But they're all relatively steady. There's some jockeying for position, but we don't see the huge jump ups like Japan or the relative decline like Switzerland. And if you want to go back, see these guys are all pretty much above the 0.2, except maybe Canada climbs above it. Germany's dipping it back too. But we've got Spain hugging the bottom pretty consistently. There's New Zealand. We've got UK near the top and bouncing around. So relatively stable. Then we've got these guys. These are the rapid innovators. Pay attention to the 0.2. These are countries that were either mid-level innovators or not even on the map. And they appear during the 70s, 80s, and then shoot up quickly into the ranks of the highest innovators. So we have Finland, Taiwan, Israel in green, Singapore in purple, and South Korea there in dark blue. So we're trying to explain what explains the stability of some countries, the relative decline of others, and the rapid jump up, especially of these highly successful rapid innovators. And one reason why I love this topic is you can get anyone involved in it. Everyone's got some ideas about how and why innovation happens. So sort of a lot of the initial theories that will get thrown out by both experts in innovation scholarship or non are these. One is the idea, which is very much the US story, military, that there's a lot of investment in military R&D and these inventions and spill out to the civilian economy and you get an innovative economy. Size, the larger the country, the more resources you have to throw at science and technology, so the more innovation you'll get out of it. Scarcity of whatever, labor, natural resources, what have you. If you don't have enough people, then you'll innovate in labor, develop lots of robotics. If you don't have a lot of energy, then you'll innovate to compensate for that, coming up with lots of alternative energy or energy efficiency innovations. Then there's the barriers to entry or increasing returns thesis. This is the idea is that once you invest all that money to build up an innovative system, all those laboratories and universities and patent systems and financial policies, et cetera, once you create all that stuff, it's easier to keep going. So this is the idea that countries that have established all that can keep going, and the younger countries will have a lot tougher time getting in there. Free riding is the opposite argument. Free riding says that the younger countries can just see what the older countries are doing and then beg, borrow, buy, or steal that technology and leapfrog ahead, free riding on all the high risk and expense that the older countries expended. Or culture, right? There's the argument that there are certain cultural values that are just good for innovation, whether it's individualism or Weber's Protestant ethic. There's just something about these cultures that lend themselves to innovation. The problem is none of these really explain innovation across countries or over time. So let's just take a look at that first slide of those top innovators, the reliable, most innovative countries in the world decade after decade. Military definitely explains the US case, but it's hard to apply it to Canada or Switzerland. We don't think of great military research and expenditures when we're thinking about a lot of these other countries. Size. We have some large countries here like the United States and Japan. We also have some very small countries like Switzerland or Sweden. What's the population of Switzerland? 10 million? Sweden is 4 or 5. And then some middle countries. Canada is 25. So size doesn't really tell us much. How about scarcity? Well, every country is relatively scarce in something, so it's kind of a tautological argument. Definitely applies to Japan, which is very good in energy and robotics, right? But if this was the explanation, then the US shouldn't be very innovative anymore. We are abundant in everything. Plenty of labor, plenty of capital, plenty of natural resources. It's hard to find something we're lacking that is spurring all the motivation here for innovation. barriers to entry, the idea that once you set up the infrastructure for innovation, you can keep it going. Well, if this were the case, we should see China on this list. China was the most innovative country in the world by a long shot in the 1300s or so. They had the beginnings of a factory system. They were beginning to use steam power. They're starting to produce basic forms of steel. They're beginning to industrialize. And yet they sort of walked away from it during the 1400s, and we're still sort of debating over why. If you don't buy the China counterexample, then why not Britain? They were at the lead of the first industrial revolution. They were kind of coming in second in the second industrial revolution, and they sort of trailed in the third. Still powerful, respectable innovators, but not at the frontier in the way they were during the first industrial revolution. And then again, if it was only the older guys, Japan, clear case of catch-up. So free riding definitely explains the Japan case. You could also apply it to Korea, Taiwan, and other recent innovators. But if catch-up by the younger countries was the case, then you should see some of these older guys falling off in the way that China and Britain did. The US and Germany were at the head of the second industrial revolution as well as the third, and they're still powerful innovators today. They're not going anywhere. Culture, we have all different cultural characteristics here. We've got very individualistic countries, very collectivist countries. We've got Protestant, Catholic, Confucius. You could pick your dimension, and it doesn't really explain the general, the global disbursement of innovation. Maybe a particular country you can apply it to, but not across the data set. So what's going on? When you talk to economists who tend to dominate the field of innovation scholarship, and business scholars, a lot of them who come from economics, they tend to focus on domestic theories of innovation. The idea that it's all about institutions and policies. And if you get the right set of institutions and policies, then that will explain the spread. And that's sort of the hunt has been on in economics and the rest of innovation scholarship for going on 30, 40 years now, is to find that secret sauce, that silver bullet of just the right policies and institutions that will explain the data that I've shown you before. So the first sort of general attempt took the form of what we now call the National Innovation Systems approach. And this was a series of economists who said, let's go take a look at what the world's most innovative countries are doing, and let's look into their institutions and policies. So they looked at different types of patent systems or trade regimes or levels and styles of R&D subsidies, policies towards labor or antitrust, et cetera. The whole, and these arrows indicate an infinite set of all these policies and institutions. And what they found is that different countries use different sets of policies and institutions. That they mattered, but there was no consistency between them. That an institution or policy that explained country X at a given point in time didn't explain country Y, or even the same country X at another point in time. So for example, if you take a look at the United States and Japan, our story is very much about military procurement, that investment in defense technology that then spills over into the general economy. Strong antitrust in the private sector with big firms getting broken up, small innovative startups that become big firms or get acquired by them, and a lot of university research spilling out into both the defense and private sector. None of this is going on in Japan. In fact, Japan is almost the opposite story, right? A lot of government control over trade and investment, big national champions, so the opposite of antitrust, very cooperative industry and labor relations rather than them competing with one another, and specific corporate management techniques like just-in-time production. And if you added Germany and Switzerland, you'd get a proliferation of all their institutions and policies which don't match US or Japan. So political scientists and economists began to say, let's take a look at the macro. Right? These are all sort of happening at the policy level. Maybe it's the general political economic environment that's really determining all this stuff. So one big theory out there was varieties of capitalism. This is the idea that the more capitalist your economy is, the more it's going to innovate. And they divided the world into liberal market economies, more markets, where there's more risk in innovation, but more risk to not innovating, and more profits or rewards to succeeding, and punishments if you stagnate. So you should have lots of revolutionary technological change. Whereas, and this is the United States, the UK, et cetera. Where you have less markets, places like Germany, Austria, where government is getting together with corporate and labor and working out arrangements. Less markets, less risk, there's more consensus, so there's less change. You should have more incremental innovation. And you can look at case studies or different measures. Again, we'll jump back to patents because people get it here. So if you look at liberal market economies, coordinated market economies, and other that don't fall into either, and we look at patent measures, we see that they all sort of fall into the same batches. Sure, we have the US as an outlier up here, and Spain as an outlier down here, but if I looked at these groups, I wouldn't say, aha, you found the explanation. It's sort of, it doesn't seem to explain everything. I'm not saying markets don't matter, but there's something else going on. So the next big and most recent contribution is best represented by these guys. Do people recognize this book, Why Nations Failed, by Acemoglu and Robinson? Big publication. Acemoglu is an MIT economist. Robinson is or was a Harvard political economist. And their big argument is you got to have democracy, and not just any democracy, but decentralized democracy. And the reason why is if you have a democracy, preferably one that's decentralized, then status quo interest groups can't take over the political process. In other words, markets rely on politics because it's these politicians that pass the policies and create the institutions that help or hurt markets. And if you get an old and big industry player, I don't know, the stereotype might be big oil, they're going to want to tax that new alternative energy or regulate it out or prevent research subsidies from going to it. So they'll take over the political process and sort of regulate and tax away new challengers. You can't do that if you've got a decentralized democracy. The states or provinces can act as experimental test beds. So the Californians over there, they can try all this alternative energy stuff. Kansas can focus on agriculture. Massachusetts can experiment in stem cell research, which would never pass in Georgia, where I'm from. We can focus on, say, agricultural logistics research. And they can act as test beds. Also, you get the states competing with one another, lowering taxes, and providing better environments for investment to attract innovators and startup firms from the other states. You can get customized policy in each state to best fit their politics, their traditions, their economies. And local policymakers simply have better information on how to create an innovative economy in their state or city than the far-off bureaucrats in Washington. So it sounds good for decentralized democracy. Problem is, it isn't supported by the data. So here's just one look. Here we've got change in decentralization on the x-axis and change in innovation rate. Again, here I use patents because people get it and we've been talking about it, but you could have used other measures or ditched quant altogether and just looked at case studies. But if decentralization mattered, you should see a nice diagonal line lining up. Is country decentralized over time? And this is from 1970 to 2012. They should get more innovative. But it's not. The data pretty much lines up on the crosshairs. So no relationship whatsoever. And one key state here that really should be the canary in the coal mine is Spain. No effect. Spain has gone from a centralized dictatorship under Franco to a decentralized democracy, free markets as well, but still has about the same relative innovation rate. No change, right? You do maybe something's going on in Republic of Korea, Taiwan, maybe Israel, there is something there, but 3 data points, these are more outliers than regulars. So this doesn't really explain it. And you could say, well, Zach, you really need more than a few decades for this to have its effect. The politics have to change, then the institutions and policies has to change, then the innovation has to come out. That's long term. So here are some of the oldest democracies in the world, bracketed into low income, middle income, and high income countries. And we have some very, very old democracies. Costa Rica, going back to 1919. We've got democracies going back into the 60s in the middle. Australia going back to 1901. New Zealand back to 1877. None of these have become high innovators by any measure. There is an asterisk next to Norway because they are very good at science, at basic science, but they're not particularly good at technological change. And you could say, well, New Zealand and Australia are small countries, so you can't really count that. Switzerland's quite small, but they're doing fantastically. So this doesn't really, it's not time either, it's not I'm not saying democracy doesn't matter, I love democracy. I love free markets. I think they're great things. But you need something else is going on here. They don't explain innovation and technological change. So why do domestic institutions sound so good in theory but fail us empirically, right? And that's because as social scientists, when we think about getting anything, and here it's technological innovation, we think about how markets work. And we think that, look, we have market failures and status quo intergroups that interfere with innovation. So the classic market failure is if one of you were to invent the cure for the common cold, I could just easily copy it and get together with my startup firm and rush out some products to market and take over the market and get all the profits, whereas you took all the risk, you spent all the money doing the research, and you get nothing for it, right? And if that's what's going to happen, then no one's going to invest in innovation because they're just going to get their stuff copied or stolen away. So we create an institution known as a patent, which gives you 17 years to have that to yourself, to own the market so you can recap your investment and hopefully make a nice profit, and that will inspire others to innovate. And there are all sorts of different market failures that afflict innovation, and the book goes into some great examples and explanations. And naturally, political scientists and economists, we tend to think anytime we see a market failure, come up with an institution. Same with status quo interest groups. When we've got these older industries that sort of want to capture the market and buy out or drive out any competition, especially new innovators, the solution is decentralization, democracy, that sort of thing. So that's where we get all of these institutions and policies. It's just naturally where we go. But when you look at the data, none of them explain what's going on. So at one point in the book, I say, well, let's throw out all this theory and let's just take a look at some of the successes and some of the failures and see what's going on. So in one section of the book, I take a look at 4 countries in the IT industry, software and hardware. So we take a look at Taiwan and Israel, starred, not recognized yet, so not a fully recognized country. So the island of Taiwan, Israel, high success stories. Ireland, sort of a middle case. And Mexico, a relative failure. My apologies to any Mexican citizens or Mexican Americans. Nothing personal, it's just not a highly innovative state. And it's not wealth. Mexico was actually wealthier than these other countries back in the 50s and 60s due to their oil wealth. But they weren't able to use that wealth to help innovation, whereas countries like Taiwan and Israel did to a fantastic degree, Israel less so. And what we see is that these countries didn't just bring in, well, first thing we see is that the different countries use different sets of institutions and policies. So there's no silver bullet. So countries can customize as fits their history, their culture, their politics, their economic situation. They don't have to, China doesn't have to copy America to be innovative. China doesn't have to copy Japan to be innovative. They can come up with their own model. And same with all the developing countries in the world. They don't have to ape the more advanced countries. What we find out is what Taiwan, Israel, and other innovative countries do, they focus on networks. Not just on solving market failures, but on solving network failures. So what they do is they actively knit science, technology, engineering workers together on solving the science and technology problems around innovation, but they also network them together with entrepreneurs, with finance, with marketing. And a good example that's discussed in the book is Israel. So Israel decides in the late 60s, early 70s, it wants to get into science and technology. So they create these highly competitive, very high talent sections within the military that focus on science, technology, engineering, research. And they recruit the best and the brightest, and they put them into these units to develop the new science and technology that they're working on. And then they circulate them back out to the private economy, where they start developing their own firms. And then years later, they circulate some of those people back in. So there's this interchange between government and the private sector flowing through and creating these networks that are transferring knowledge and relationships that you wouldn't ordinarily get. And these aren't just domestic networks, they're international. So as they're developing these new companies and technologies, the Israeli government starts making connections between these people and the Jewish populations in places like New York, San Francisco, for sources of finance, expertise on marketing, product development. So when you get into the 1990s, Israel has the most companies listed on the NASDAQ after the United States. And similar stories in Taiwan. Taiwan actively starts knitting together its scientists and engineers around particular product lines in government-funded research institutes. Then they start reaching out to the Taiwanese expat communities in Silicon Valley and in New York. And they actually bring these people back to develop these companies and cycle them through. So they're creating these networks, churning people around and developing over time. You don't get the same thing going on in places like Mexico, Ireland, and the other low or mid-level innovators. So governments need to not just solve market failures, but also to sort of promote these type of networks. So one of the big message to economists, so that's kind of one group that I'm kind of debating in the book. When economists see this problem, they say, it's a domestic problem, we need to find the right institutions and policies. So one of the message from the case studies and the data in this book is, A, it's not just an institutions and policy problem, it's also a networks problem. And B, it's not just an institutions problem, it's not just a domestic problem, it's an international problem. So we want to think about international, we want to think about networks. Of course, this just backs up the question, right? Because now the question is, why are some countries better at setting up these institutions and networks and not others? And that's a lot of me talking, and we'll go there, but I'm sure there are a lot of questions and comments. So let me pause and see if people have questions or comments at this point.
Great. Thank you so much. That's really very informative and a lot of good, dense material. So I think let's open it up for a few questions, and then we'll sort of guide the discussion. So anyone have a burning question? Oh, yeah.
Could you talk for a minute then on those networks? Innovation ecosystems. What is the root basis of what those networks are achieving by people talking?
Clarify the question a little.
Well, if what you're saying is that among the best things that these nations can encourage is networks, innovation ecosystems, what is it about those networks? What are the root values of the networks that those nations should be most focused on?
Okay. So let's start with that question, and then do you want to jump in and share your question over here?
I would like if you could talk more about the Mexican case. What are according to your research, why is the Mexican case failing in innovation?
Okay.
Great. So we're going to start with these two questions, this idea of sort of teasing out this networks and sort of where are we seeing these social networks and how they operate, and then sort of a deep dive on the Mexican example.
Right. So I actually have a chapter in the book that sort of goes deep into both the data and the theories on networks, and particularly relevant to innovation. And we tend to see networks doing two things. There's a lot of knowledge and information that just doesn't get captured either by the market or by government. Whereas networks do. For example, hiring highly specialized STEM labor. So if you are starting up a biotech firm here in New York, you would probably know which universities to poach from in New York, from New York universities, and maybe even throughout New England. But there might be some amazing biotech researchers that you could use out in California or off in Singapore or Britain. And if you just posted an advertisement in the free market, you're not gonna get those. But you can tap into your network of people who you knew from college, from business, what have you, and they will be able to identify some of these people within the US or even overseas that just placing an ad in the free market wouldn't get you. Also, as we've all hired people, or a lot of people you've taken part in the hiring process, you know that the resume or the cover letter or even the interview doesn't tell the whole story, right? You can have people who look fantastic on paper or do wonderful things, but simply cannot participate in teams, right? Or maybe they have relied on their teammates or other people, and some of what's on their resume represents work that they've borrowed rather than stuff that they've accomplished on their own. That's not going to be available in the free market, that type of knowledge. But your network of friends and colleagues, et cetera, will know that stuff. They'll say, hey, not only is this person sharp, they're mature, they're professional, they work great in teams, versus, wow, that person's really good, but I tell you, they're just a disaster, they destroy every team that they're a part of. That type of information you're not going to capture. So it's information, and I would call it, for lack of a better word, trust. You can find and access in networks that you can't get either in free markets or in government-controlled ways of interacting. Does that answer the question? Okay, so Mexico. So this will take me to the next question, because the story behind Mexico and a lot of the successes and failures is what I call in the book creative insecurity theory, right? Everyone needs a theory to put a name to, so that's what I did. That's the idea that all societies create two sets of tensions, threats, whatever you want to call it. Domestically, and we see this in the political landscape today in the United States, you have different groups of people who feel threatened by each other. It could be across ethnic or racial lines, it could be economic, rich or poor, it could be geographic, it could be religion, but these are in every country, everywhere, right? Every country also has external threats. Some of them are military. I'm worried about being invaded by my neighbor or my enemy. Or it's just an economic threat. I don't have a very competitive economy, and I need foreign exchange to buy stuff, like we don't make a lot of energy or food, or I need weapons to defend myself, so I need to earn enough in the global economy to buy that stuff. So I argue that it's that balance of threats that determine whether people are willing to innovate. That when the domestic threats are high, you get worried about innovation, right? Because innovation is going to benefit some people at the expense of others. You know, these autonomous vehicles are going to throw a lot of taxi drivers and perhaps truck drivers out of work. If I'm a taxi or truck driver, I don't want those things passing. So I'm going to contact my congressman, I'll get my union together and exert political pressure to tax them, to regulate them. Now, I'm not going to say I might say I don't want to lose my job, but I'll come up with those are dangerous. I'm more reliable, right? They don't actually save money. They're really an expensive waste of the taxpayer's dollar. I'll come up with whatever reason I can to regulate, to tax, to get research subsidies taken away from that technology that threatens me. So technology creates winners and losers in the economy. The losers aren't anti-science and technology. They just don't like that technology over there. And they pressure their leaders, whether it's in a democracy or not, to tax it, regulate it. Only in the presence of an external threat, like, hey, we're going to get invaded or we're not going to be able to compete if we don't innovate, will the innovation begin to flow. So it's that balance between those two. So let me see where I've got that. So here's a shot from the book. And again, I use different measures, I use case studies, etc. But I try and get a sense of that balance of threat across countries. And here, on a very simplistic measure of 1 to 5, these are countries with more of an external threat and less of a domestic threat. These are countries with more domestic senses of attention and less external. And you get something of a relationship. It comes through a lot better because statistics are rough when measuring this sort of thing in the cases. So the story in Mexico then is you have decades, almost an entire history of fighting, both political and physical, between the different groups within Mexico. And as those domestic tensions flare up, and even to the point of civil war, you get less investments in science and technology. Only when they solidify and unite do you begin to get investments in science and technology. So I'm going to forget his name. Is it Diaz, Porfirio Diaz, in the late 1800s? He unifies the country after decades of dreadful civil war. And we get to see an enormous surge in investment in science and technology in Mexico. So we get the mining industry, begin investment in basic research, and Mexico really begins to rise up in the world in science and technology. Then that dictatorship falls apart, Mexico backs into civil war, it all gets destroyed. Sorry, we got a hand up.
More specifically, how does the drug trade affect Mexico's capacity for innovation?
I don't know the details of the drug trade, so I can't answer that with any expertise, but I would assume it might hurt it. And maybe a more simplistic way to make my point is that any dollar or peso that you spend on science and technology is a dollar or peso that you're not spending on policing the drug trade or welfare or infrastructure or tax cuts or, in corrupt countries, lining elite pockets. So people are competing for these resources. And remember, science and technology is very expensive and very risky. And a lot of many taxpayers are not going to want to tolerate those high levels of expense and risk unless there's a darn good excuse for it. And that's where, oh my God, we have this national threat from outside. We got to earn the money to pay for the things we need, or we need to compete militarily to do that. Solyndra is a good case, right? Now in science and technology, you have tons of big failures. And we expect that sort of thing. But when the taxpayers say, okay, we're going to invest in alternative energy, and they see the cylinder failure, and they go, oh my God, what a dreadful case of loss of money. This was corrupt. It's government picking winners and losers. This was a disastrous policy. Well, what they're saying was what goes on in the research process turning out a failure. And they go, we can't have that. We want successes. We should be having successes all the time. If there's a failure, this just shows that this is a waste of our money. We want that money back.
And I think it's a great question, and it's a great point about, there is sort of a reluctance for risk on behalf of elected officials. And, maybe if you want to say a few words about how you're thinking about this in our contemporary political climate, right? There's different constituencies. And, to this question of there may be winners and losers as we think about innovation. And if we don't have the public policy dimensions to more equally distribute the effects, there are going to be different constituencies. And I think we're seeing a lot of this playing out this election cycle.
I agree. I think that, we've seen it played out in science for the past decade or two. So you get, some people call it the war on science. But why should we be funding this stuff, especially when it offends some people's cultural values like stem cell research or what have you? Or you'll get older industries like the carbon industry fighting subsidies or research in new technology, or just the people on Cape Cod who don't want ugly windmills out blocking their horizon, right? So it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts. And I go through several case studies of this in the book. So it's both a policy response and, okay, how do we coerce, convince, or compensate the losers so that they're willing to support this? And there's also a political aspect, right? How do we talk up the sense, how do we make people really feel that sense of expense is justified? Now, the classic case, and we've done this in the US since World War II, is to talk about the external threat. So we had a lot of great science spending and technology development spending done based on Cold War rationalities, and we still begin to do it today. And we're beginning, China is the new threat that we need to defend against. And there's a mix of truth and fiction to that. And the Chinese are doing the same thing, right? America is then the big threat, and we need to, and so they're sort of justifying that. And if you look at S&T and R&D types of spending, whether it's on education or basic research or what have you, the more it gets rolled into the defense budget, the more likely it is to pass. So whereas the defense spending used to be just weapons, now it's weapon systems, it's education, it's energy, it's medicine, anything that legislators or scientists can justify in terms of defense will sort of wrap. So now everything is becoming defense spending, because that justifies the expenditures.
Right, that's a great question. I'm gonna go to some questions in a second, but we often hear about this idea of what was the magic in Silicon Valley, and can that be replicated? And we're here at Columbia, we're in New York, and we often think about, can we take some of that magic here to New York City? So I'd be curious your thoughts on, you must hear this a lot, this idea of let's create Silicon Valley and sort of the energy and the dynamism that took place there. But it's undeniably a story of networks, which you do talk about in the book.
Right. So the question is, can other countries or other cities recreate Silicon Valley? And the answer is yes and no. Yes, I think any country or city or state can recreate Silicon Valley, but no, not by copying Silicon Valley. That's the good news from this research, is that policymakers can customize their approach to being innovative that best fits their situation, their economic, their industry, their history, their culture, their values. So they can think freely. They got to solve the market failures. They got to set up those networks and maintain them. And they got to motivate the taxpayers and the voters to support this sort of thing. But they have free rein to innovate and think broadly in how to do that. And I think that should be sort of like candy to anyone in a public policy school, because you get sort of a wide canvas on which to paint.
Let's jump in here. Yeah, you.
Following up on Holly's previous question about what can policymakers do to incentivize innovation, I think you go into much detail about what incentivizes more innovation, but could you talk more about what incentivizes the right innovation? And to take the examples that you were using before, the windmill, etc., you're describing status quo groups as something that's only a hindrance to innovation, but it might also be the case that in some other contexts, opposition to an innovation is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, or innovation is not a good thing in itself. Rather, it happens in a context of winners and losers, as you have already described. And so, for example, I'm thinking of autonomous vehicles, which you said will kill would kill a lot of jobs. It's natural that those kinds of innovations would be resisted. So can you talk about a bit more about?
So I'm a big, obviously, I love science and technology. I think it creates an enormous amount of wealth, raises standards of living. We all benefit from it, especially over the long run. But in the short run, some people get hurt. I'm not one of them, so I'm in a privileged position. So I can't wait for autonomous vehicles to hit. But again, if I was a taxi driver or a truck driver with kids to feed and put through college, I'm not going to be so excited about that. So I think it's up to people on my side to say, okay, we're willing to come up with the policies and yes, maybe even share the resources or share the wealth enough to make a way for these other groups to survive, whether it's through education or some aspects of welfare. And I'm not a huge fan of welfare. But if you create too much inequality, then the ones who are the losers get out there and exercise their vote. And then you kind of see it in the American political system right now. A lot of the supporters of Trump are all these people who are on the wrong end of globalization and technological change. And if they get their way, they might shut some of it down, and then we all lose. So we need to find and figure out a policy way and a political way to come to a consensus. Otherwise, we risk killing the goose that has laid the best golden eggs in history.
It's an interesting phrase, to say the wrong end, right? Because, I think for me it's that it's incumbent upon policymakers, and it's part of, what's great about sort of thinking and studying these issues here at SEPA. It's incumbent upon all of us in, various kinds of sectors to think about the kinds of policies that can, lift all boats, reduce inequality, and really think about the public good. And so I think that's part of a tension with, I think, this narrative of, the winners and the losers, because in a sense, right, these tools at a meta level should be agnostic, but then they're not because of our highly contentious, politicized policy environment. I don't know if you've ever seen an example in your vast research where it wasn't like this.
No, I haven't. And that's the real policy problem.
Yeah.
Is what do? You're never going to eliminate inequality. There are always going to be poor and wealthy. But I do think you want to reduce it to levels where it's not poisoning the political system. Yes, sir.
Define globalization and explain why innovation depends on it.
So globalization would be the movement towards a single global market for goods, services, capital, labor, information, right? I know I'm in a single market when a bottle of cola in one section costs the same as a bottle of cola in the other, right? So we have global markets for things like oil and other commodities. So is it necessary? It definitely helps, because innovation, if you want to solve really big problems, you need a lot of resources and a lot of specialists. So you can innovate more. A city will innovate better than a neighborhood. A state will innovate better than a city. A country will innovate better than a state, right? Because you get economies of scale, economies of scope, brings down prices, increases the amount of specialization, and increases the number of resources that you can bear. So if you want to solve big problems like cancer or climate change or the future of energy, that might require global cooperation and focus on these things. So I find it difficult to see a way forward without globalization, but we need to recognize that globalization causes a lot of pain and suffering in the world too.
Other questions? Let's open it up for questions. I know you guys have them. You're just being shy right now.
Or critiques or disagreements. I offer this as an answer, but it's not the only answer. So people who have disagreements, feel free to speak up.
Anyone in the back here? Yeah.
Networks depend on methods of communication. And what has been striking about the world in this century is the spread of international languages. English, mathematics. See, I've been around a long time, and I have observed the spread of English across many countries. See, among the barriers is older languages, which turns out to be dysfunctional. The Mexicans have had one of the previous international languages, Spanish, which is now in decline. But English and mathematics are the international methods. You can see in this building, all these people from all these societies. When they first were born, they were greeted by the local language. Now they're all at home in these international languages.
So if computer power eliminates language as a barrier, if I can have a microphone and an earpiece that translates, that might even further help out.
Yes, in the back on the right there. Chris.
So there's a theory or a trend in foreign policy today that argues the United States is actually pretty safe from external threat, right? So you have books like Barry Posen's Restraint and a whole host of people. If your theory is right, adopting the foreign policies recommended by that crowd would actually be anti-innovative, if I read you correctly. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. So
And I
another,
think-
another reason to hate on restraint.
I think we're baby stepping in that direction, and you see it in the sciences. You see it in the science, the money going towards it, and the outputs coming out of American science. We're now sort of slowly declining relative to some other countries. I argue in the book, so one obvious implication is, okay, let's just make up enemies all over the world. But I argue in the book that that's not productive. It doesn't last. Eventually the lie comes out. But we have real external threats like the environment, climate change, energy, the diseases and debilitations of aging would be nice to focus on, that all of us can agree upon. So I think the politics of framing these threats would be far more productive than us pointing at China or China pointing at us and going, that's the enemy, we need to out-innovate them.
And you talk about in the book, how do we communicate this to voters and to interest groups? How do you think we should communicate this?
I'm a big education guy, but there are limits to that. I think that's where entrepreneurial, both policymakers and politicians need into the game.
So it's
that's not
very
my
super
specialty.
relevant, though.
I mean, if Trump can market his stuff, we can market this stuff.
Oh, that's a slogan to take with you out of this room. I have a million questions. I mean, I'm fascinated by this book, and I think it's endlessly relevant. But there are other questions right now that people have. You talk about in the book, you do some of the case studies, and when you talk about the Israeli case, you talk about the role that the government played to sort of be a catalytic investor and sort of take some of that risk away. And on some of the work that I do, I see foundations and other sort of actors pushing government to be more innovative, so taking that sort of first mover advantage and really showing the outcomes. Any other examples that you think might be relevant for this group about where the government could sort of spur more innovation?
I do think sort of the private-public partnerships are interesting. I haven't gone this route because this is all sort of fresh, so I'm looking at the next stuff. I do think especially in our current environment, we have maxed out what the federal government could do. We need to be looking at what state and city governments can do. What can private foundation, like the Gates Foundation, et cetera, can do beyond just giving money? Could they be creating networks? I think picking major challenges, identifying, okay, here's a problem we want to solve, and then forming networks around that problem could be a very useful solution. And foundations have experimented with that. The government should possibly get more into that. I don't make a whole lot of policy recommendations in the book.
No, I think that's very compelling. And for those of you not familiar with sort of the move for Pay for Success or for their innovative financing mechanisms, where you sort of make these public-private matches towards a specific outcome, like reducing recidivism. That was a big, social impact bond that Goldman Sachs helped run. I think this is sort of the trend that we're going to see, and it's sort of where this idea of innovation and governance meet back on the other side. There's also some interesting examples in the book where you talk about places that sort of were once innovative and maybe then they decline and then maybe they are innovative again. One example that stuck with me in the US context is the Route 128 example. I know you've spent some time, you did your doctorate at MIT. Curious your thoughts about that sort of innovation ecosystem, particularly the role of universities as sort of these places where people are coming up with ideas, can be sort of a gatekeeper between these ideas and the public world. It's something that we're sort of actively thinking about here at SIPA, sort of the role of the university to sort of spawn and foster entrepreneurship and innovation.
So when network people look at Route 128, they compare it to Silicon Valley. And they say, look, what happened in Route 128 is you had companies hiring science, technology, engineering people, and high-quality business people, and hugging them and holding on to them, and having non-compete and punishing people trying to punish people if they left or keep them from leaving. Silicon Valley, there was a lot of circulation, not just between companies, but people jumping off to do their own startups or forming little clubs to innovate and check out little technologies. That's where we get some of the personal computing technology. So they argue that Route 128 fought networking, whereas Silicon Valley sort of fed networking, and that's their explanation. And I think universities do have a role. So if you wanted to mimic Israel and start feeding, letting some of the science people out into industry and government and back into university, universities generally want to keep their researchers doing research. That's what they're there for. But if we can come up with a model where they can spend a few years at companies and then spend a few years in government looking at policy, then not only does the system benefit, but that researcher understands now the private sector and the policy sector, so they can now inform them about research and inform his fellow researchers about how these other sectors work, and you get that knowledge flowing. Whereas before, I'm a physicist in a lab, all I know is my lab, the other stuff is not my problem.
I think that's really interesting, and it relates to an idea that's also in the book about, training. How do we think about training? Not necessarily government handouts or subsidies as the only remedy, but how do we train for the next generation of the workforce? And so it's sort of a two-part question that I think is, highly relevant for the work we're trying to do here. As people studying public policy, what is that dual skill set? You bring your great background in physics to sort of the international affairs arena. And then, related to that, as we're thinking about, again, in this, election year, what are the kinds of roles for people, sort of mid-career people? So if you're, perchance a driver who may be displaced in a driverless car future, it's sort of the pipeline. How do we think about people coming out of the academy who are going to be, entering as graduates from a graduate program of SEPA, and then people sort of along their career? How do we sort of give them the vocational training to stay up to date in the economy of tomorrow?
Right. So I think for students in SEPA, if you want to get into policy or even the private sector, you got to learn how to solve the problems you got to understand the problems that they face and learn how to solve them. And you can't solve policy problems without data and without good methodology and analysis. So learn all those data gathering tools and those methodological techniques, whether it's statistics and quantitative, or social network analysis, or GIS, or just how to go out there and administer good surveys, or conduct proper interviews, or do good case studies, or go into different countries and do industry studies. So I think it's those methods and data techniques that will really not just help get hired, but help you solve problems out there in the real world. As far as the truck driver threatened by, I don't know. I think it's blue sky to say, oh, we'll teach them how to program software. I think if I'm a 35, 40-year-old truck driver, I'm not going to learn software. There needs to be something else. Maybe that's where some form of welfare is appropriate for the sake of technological change. But again, I'm sort of a free market, lean libertarian guy. So I get worried about what does that mean for people who are subsidized and we're paying off just so they don't get hurt. I think there's a real policy problem.
Well, I think, the subsidy question aside, as we talk about, you don't necessarily know what innovations are going to bring, but, given your vast research, maybe we could think more creatively about different kinds of fields that people could be a part of, right? I don't think people want necessarily to live their life without meaningful, creative, expressionful work.
And I think that's sort of broad philosophical question. All of us in this room, we find meaning through our work, through our careers. That defines us. That's why we're here. Otherwise, we wouldn't be going to an amazing place like Columbia. And if you take that away from us, what do we have? We're bored. Well, okay, I'm not saying the taxi driver lives to be a taxi driver, the truck driver, but that's part of their identity, their standing. And they're bringing home the bacon. They're an earner in their family and amongst their friends. You take that away from them, what are they waking up in the morning for?
So do you feel optimistic that we, as a globalized economy, might come up with creative solutions for this jobless displacement?
I
guess that's the crux of
I think
this
it's
question.
really challenging, but it gets very philosophical, right? What means anything? What are we living for? right? And as technology or globalization eliminates more and more jobs, how do we define meaning, right? How do I, as a young person, say, oh, I'm going to participate and be someone in the world if a lot of these jobs no longer exist? I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, Hugo, you've been
Challenging your libertarian free market.
get in there.
I'm not one of these
Get in there.
crazy.
I think that's
pure-
ripe for a disruption.
I just wanted to come back to, because you're mentioning the fact that the taxi driver also lives to fulfill his job, and
Right.
that's how he earns money. I think we also have to recognize the fact that, and you recognized it earlier, that innovation also creates losers, and that without getting into the specifics of how exactly it is that innovation produces losers and who these people are, then there actually is no way to have a policy where you reduce inequality. And I actually think that the way we produce innovation and the definition of innovation is should be very much at the forefront of policy debates, because this is what produces most of the inequalities today. And to displace the conversation from the United States to other countries, I'm from France, for example, and I would argue that even if through the measure of the definition of innovation that you're producing, that you're presenting here, I would argue that there are many things we create that do more for the social welfare of individuals there, and
Right.
therefore I would argue that national countries can choose which innovations they want, instead of having one single definition of innovation applied all over the globe with one single measure for it.
So this is at the
That's a
very
really
cutting
interesting
edge
question.
of innovation policy, right? And two countries to compare are Israel, which used to have very low inequality, and they didn't share the innovation within society. So now there's a lot of inequality in Israel, but they're one of the most innovative countries in the world. Finland has done the opposite. Finland was a very low inequality country. They've become very innovative, but they've worked in policies that keep inequality relatively low. They haven't eliminated it, and I don't expect any country will. But studying these countries and building those solutions into science and technology policy might be the way forward. But I do think there are solutions, because some countries have pulled it off.
Well, I think it's also, Hugo, it's a great question, because I think it touches upon this culture aspect, the sort of norms, mores, which you touch upon on the book, right? In France, there is, people respect certain things, like the purity of wine that's regulated by the state, right? And in the United States and some other countries, there have been other things that have been valued, right? I mean, I think you see in our country, like, we're continually willing to take the shiny object over really engaging with these questions of the environmental impacts, economic disparity. So I think there is sort of these really big questions of, like, what is the role of the public sector? I want you to jump in, and then I think, Chris, you had another question as well. If you guys could both share it.
Hi, I just kind of wanted to expand on this discussion and maybe just make a note that you spoke about how different countries require different policies to promote innovation, but I think that also you can bring that down to a micro scale. You have different cultures within a country, within a city that might require different policies to spur innovation. So I don't know if you have any thoughts, but if we want to look at different risks that different cultures within a city are facing, I think we might have to start talking about a more inclusive form of creating innovation.
That's a great question as well.
No, I think that's accurate. I think that's one of the major future avenues for this type of research, is looking at the more micro level, at the states, at the cities, et cetera, and what can these governments do or not do, what should they do or shouldn't do. So I don't have answers for you yet, but let's meet in 5 years.
But I think a part of that question also is the sort of the multi-stakeholders, right, who might be involved in these decisions. And, from my vantage point, there's a real limit in the governance structures to empower these diverse voices to even have a seat at the table, to your point about education. But I think that's going to have to be one of the sort of parallel movements, right, for every innovation. What sort of a governance structure that allows a diverse viewpoints of the people impacted by it to be at the table? Yeah, sir.
I'm kind of curious how your innovation chart would look if you were to analyze the birth country of the patent holders, because that would really, involve the culture of the countries where they were from into the whole equation. Because looking at Taiwan and Israel, both cultures are really heavily they heavily emphasize education as part of the culture.
Right.
whereas the other countries don't. So I'm just kind of curious whether, the national origin and the culture.
So there hasn't been a whole lot of experimental approaches on this, or quasi-experimental. And I can think of how you might approach this, but no one's done it yet. I've dabbled in some of the statistical measure, and yeah, there are some people who try and create statistical measures of culture. Individualism seems to matter, but certain forms of collectivism do too. I don't know if there is, because you go across time, almost every culture has innovated at one time or another. So I don't think there is an innovative, a set of cultural values necessarily that says these people are going to be more innovative than those people. I do think that the sense of insecurity matters. So if you have some cultures, subgroups within a country that have been peripheralized, and they feel sort of separated out, and they feel that sense of insecurity, they can often be a lot more innovative. And I'm blanking on some of the researchers and titles, but if you want to talk afterwards, I can mention. Clifford Geertz did a study on this in Indonesia. Some have done a study on Jewish communities around the world, but these cultural groups that are sort of peripheralized, and they feel, oh my God, a little bit insecure, so they get very emphasize education, performance, innovation.
And I think some of these questions really go to this point of this globalized innovation narrative, but there's also this sort of localized identity narrative. And so where do the two of them meet back on the other side? I mean, that's part of the story of your book, right?
Yeah.
Further thoughts on that?
I have no comment on that.
Other thoughts? I think, yeah.
I wonder how much you have thought about gravity models in terms of saying how innovation collects upon itself. New York is a great example of why innovators come. San Francisco's swell, but New York's doing just fine. It doesn't have quite the same scale. And when we talk about an accelerating rate of change in what we're developing in displacement of jobs, the question goes away from innovation policy into welfare policy. How do we reallocate people? But it argues on urban policy, everything else. What is creating the environments in which innovators come to the resource networks that they know work? And then the jobs are around those. When you ask the question of what's going to happen to the 5.5 million US truckers who get displaced, that's where automation is going first before cars, because I've talked to those companies doing it. And we have to ask the question, what are they good for after that? And gamification has been an example of how you do low-grade coding for people on their way to other jobs.
Yeah.
But they're not going to get it in Kansas. They're going to be more likely to get it in upstate New York, which is at least that much closer to the New York model. I know I'm expounding, forgive me, but at some point, what is it about the relationship of place that comes back to the question of innovation and people naturally finding the networks that already exist?
I don't think they've figured that out yet. This would be sort of the industrial cluster, technology cluster, innovation cluster scholarship, and there's a section on that in the book. Again, they focus in on the social networks. As far as proximity, I look at the national level, so I don't look at industries or individual companies. But that would say, Canada is doing great. You could say, well, they're close to the US, so they're getting all these spillovers and all sorts of stuff. But Mexico is doing terribly, and they're just as proximate. In fact, I'd say there are more Mexicans as a percentage of the population living in the US than Canadians, maybe? I don't know that for sure, but I'll guess that.
The USEDA has a resource called US Cluster Mapping, if you may or may not be familiar with it. It's a very useful tool, and when we use it, when we look at what industries are really finding their natural supports, I would love to know if your research in the future could include understanding how those clusters are currently static or changing.
Right. It's called US Cluster Mapping.
US Cluster Mapping under EDA.
Okay.
But if you type US Cluster Mapping, you'll find it. I think it's a great resource, but it's limited. Great, there's the cluster. What do I do with it?
Right.
Other than assuming this is where I should go find battery technologies.
Right. I think it's, sort of like these social networks sort of rediscovered after, was it Krugman wrote his? One of the Harvard researchers, and again, I'm blanking, wrote a big book in the 1990s. And so since then, they've been doing a lot of qualitative case studies. Now we're beginning to get the quantitative and the other network analysis. So I think we're at the stage of the data where we need another 5 to 10 years to get some of those dynamics. So I agree with you.
We look forward to hearing what we do next.
Sure.
Other questions? Yeah.
I'm wondering if there is a way to evaluating the value of an external stress on the country. And what I mean by that, like Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about putting on the moon, and suddenly there was a fear in the 1960s, and it's galvanized a large segment of the population to fund NASA. And there's other instances, of course. Israel is under constant stress. I'm assuming Taiwan because of China, South Korea because of North Korea. But is there like a formula or models to actually evaluate how beneficial each external conflict?
Not a good one. I mean, this is the limits of statistical methods here, or quantitative methods. So what did I try and use? So I try and use things like labor strikes, economic inequality. These are measures of internal tension. And then external, how exposed is your economy to how much you need imports of food or energy? Do you have recent histories of wars that are keeping people war? Do you have recent histories of civil wars? Do you have military? Do you have some type of dictatorship that represents status quo industry? And I try and look at these and create a rough quantification, which is where I come up with this. So it's rough, but it gives you a taste test, right? Okay, I kind of see it. When you get to the case studies, then you really see it. Because security is ultimately, there's a subjective component to it. What scares me is not going to scare you or the next person over. So there is a subjective component to it.
And a follow-up question, the threat of, asymmetric warfare, terrorism. There are some people who say that, 9/11, it sort of dampened the creative entrepreneurial spirit of New York City. Curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I would say history shows that it didn't. I mean, New York seems just as innovative, if not more, now than it did, but I don't know the data.
Yeah. It was a Columbia person, actually, who said this to me, and I thought it was very compelling. Yeah, Brennan.
I just want to press you a little bit, since we're on the topic of threat, about replacing an external threat in the sense of another nation, state, or group with a sort of more a grand cosmic threat, the threat you said, of aging or climate change, things like that. I mean, a lot of the social science research emphasizes the importance of in-group and out-group.
Right.
I'm just having a hard time imagining. It's very easy to imagine the Soviet Union as an out-group. It's tough to imagine climate change as an out-group in the same way. So do you really think you can mobilize the kind of support that you, I think, absolutely describe as critical for this around things that aren't personifiable in the same way that motivates people?
I gotta admit, I'm a little bit pessimistic, but they are real threats. Like the diseases of aging, stare us all in the face, right? And that's something we'd all like solve. So that's a real external threat. As climate change becomes more apparent and affects food, energy, disease, et cetera, that's going to become real. And I think there is a lot of framing and subjectivity to it. I think people, I'm in Georgia, so guns are everywhere, and there's this campus carry debate at Georgia Tech. I'm really not that scared of my students carrying guns. But a lot of my northern friends are like, oh my God, that's terrible, you're going to die. I'm like, no, not everyone has guns. They're probably already bringing guns on campus. So what's the difference? But a lot of my northern friends where there is a concern. And there's no objectivity to that threat, it's purely subjective. I mean, Israelis have a high tolerance for domestic terror attacks that many of my friends in the suburbs or rural communities would find abysmal. So I'm pessimistic, but I think there's a subjective component that would make it possible. I don't know, this is one area of your expertise. What do you think?
I mean, my question was sort of already skewed towards that. I see lots of examples of people being motivated to oppose an out-group, right? The example you just gave of the Israelis is an out-group example. The example you gave of my colleagues here at Columbia. I went to Georgia Tech, so I'm one of the unwashed that would probably be carrying a firearm down there. We have different attitudes, right? But that's still an in-group, out-group thing, right? Unwashed Southerners carrying guns versus Northeastern elites, right? These are still human in-group, out-group dynamics, whereas climate change is, I mean, as you say, maybe when it's more apparent, right? And we can really say, Superstorm Sandy was absolutely tied to climate change. That might personify it a little more, but it's still not another.
Political entrepreneur, a politician, innovate and create an in-group, out-group dynamic. Create a bogeyman that we all need to fight. I think there are a lot of made-up enemies out there in history. Could we make one up? That enemy.
One that isn't another
It's
entity,
tough.
right? I mean, even the movie The Watchmen, right? He
Right.
tries to create an enemy that's still another thing.
Right.
It's another entity. It's not.
It's not, because I think the in-group, out-group dynamics matter, because if I'm some ambitious nobody out there, the way I get ahead in politics is create an in-group, out-group dynamic that may be totally fictional. And if we're all in the same group, I can't get ahead. I need to create some sort of enemy over there that we're fighting, and that might be within our own society. So I think that's dead on. I don't know how it's going to work. I hope it's possible, but I think it's a great insight.
I saw Jamaica on one of the list of countries that has had a democracy for the past 40, 50 years or so, and sort of has not innovated, and has not been or had a lot of innovation. And some of the other countries in like South America, Central America, have you thought about access to capital as a barrier to sort of innovation? People are not necessarily looking at these places. And you're talking about the markets, and you talk about government. I'm sure these governments would be thrilled to have their citizens, developing things and funding them, but maybe they just don't have the capital. What role does that play in innovation?
It plays a role because you need the resources, but there was very little capital in post-war Japan or Korea or Taiwan, but they were able to get it. Again, where do they get it from? They, begged, borrowed, stole it. Part of it is that they were the front lines of the Cold War, so they got it from the United States, so they were able to justify. And then once they got it, a lot, for Taiwan, they misspent it. There was a lot of corruption in Korea and Taiwan and Japan. It wasn't until they said, oh my God, we need these weapons, and the book discusses the Taiwan case, the Japan case is well documented, same with the Korea case. It wasn't until they decided, oh wow, we need to start spending this capital on science and technology as opposed to welfare, paying off our buddies, that sort of thing. So I think if Jamaica felt threatened, they would be able, they would quickly begin to organize along those.
Well, it sounds like there's an interplay. If the U.S. saw it maybe as a strategic ally in the war and
Right, we can pump as much money as we wanted to into Jamaica, and as long as they don't feel their own sense of threat, they're just going to use it for whatever they want to use it for. That's the Middle East, right? We pump tons of money into Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. They don't innovate, they just buy their technology.
It seems like based on that example, there wouldn't be a need to be pumping money into Jamaica for the U.S. or for the rest of economies that could pump money. So thank you for explaining that.
And Camille, it's a great question. And I think, on the UNGA week, we have the United Nations here. And I think this is a really important question of, pie in the sky, where, we're here at a policy school. What could a UN innovation fund do? If it's not just capital, would it be specific kinds of, incentives or, I don't know. Now my brain is sort of imagining all these things where you could take entrepreneurs from different countries and give them some support, some capital, some, friendly policies. I mean, if you could sort of do something on a more global scale to sort of equalize the playing field of innovation, what would you do?
I think they'd have to solve global problems, right?
Okay, right.
Like climate change or energy. So they could say, okay, we're going to do a global fund to solve the fusion problem, what have you. And we're going to draw innovators from around and businessmen, et cetera, from around the country. We're going to research technological solutions. We're going to develop marketing campaigns and finance models, et cetera. So they could be sort of a venture capital type of organization for this type of global problem that individual countries aren't solving very well.
I hope all the students in the room are listening. This could be you. You could work on this. Sir.
One of the points that I've heard made in the past when you were talking about England's lead in research was that they were very good at inventing things, but it was the U.S. that was good in turning those inventions into industries. In your research currently, have you found the difference between the ability to come up with innovation and actually use it effectively in society for industrial service purposes?
There is something that innovation scholars call the valley of death between innovation and prototype and marketable product, that a lot of innovations, and I know there are policymakers in DC that are trying to address that. But that is a concern. I haven't looked at that in particular. But where it does get solved, it does seem to be a lot of these networks help create or bring together the knowledge of how to solve those problems. The market doesn't, it's a market failure. The market doesn't solve it, but these networks do seem to better than the market. And it's not an area that I've looked at deeply, so I can't get a deeper answer than that one.
You know, it's a great question. And in the book, he talks about the transistor and how people, you know, in England didn't really know what to do with this thing for many decades, right? And so are there technologies right now that you think, you know, we've been developing in the US, but maybe we don't know how to really use them for their full potential?
If I did, I might be out there investing in them. Right?
He might not be sitting here talking to us this hour. Hugo, and yes, Camille.
One thing that comes to mind is as European Union is building a digital single market, they are actually also doing a huge investment in European industries. And one of the things that they're focusing on, maybe partly to answer your question, is access. Is this idea that, you know, by bringing more people connected to the innovation that is already happening, well, you might end up having more interesting uses of the innovation that already exists. And I think that also goes back to your question about, you know, is there an underdeveloped or exploited technology in the US? Well, maybe the solution to that might be to bring more people to look at the issue instead of just innovating more and more and more.
Thoughts on this people point?
I think one thing that if governments or whoever, policymakers, did want to get involved as far as getting more people into the innovation space is, and I'm not sure how you do this, is making it cool. It's cool to be an innovator in the United States. You go right to the top of the social hierarchy in a lot of cities, right? Geeks rule the world in a lot of cities. They get wealthy, they get invited to all the parties, they have the cool whatever it is, they get all the hot boyfriends, girlfriends, spouses, whatever. You don't see that as much in other countries. In a lot of the developing world, it's being the soccer star. Or in a lot of poor neighborhoods, it's in the arts or in music. These are all innovative, creative spaces, but we want them to innovate and create in science and technology and in business. So I think increasing the luster of being a scientist, engineer, entrepreneur throughout that, I think that would help. I don't know, that doesn't directly answer your question, but it's sort of been lingering in the back of my head while you were talking.
But I'd love to just push on that for one more question, right? Because it's a very interesting, but it's also a very provocative statement in a way, right? When we're talking about, you know, the role of culture, micro communities, what we value as a society, right? So in this schema, it wasn't always the case in the U.S., right? The narrative is this sort of revenge of the nerds, the takeover of, you know, by Silicon Valley. And so what is that? Is it our sort of, you know, free market capitalism fantasy of the new? I mean, what do you think, in your, you know, opinion, more so than your scholarly research, is driving this, you know, fetishization of the innovator in the U.S.?
I think it's because scientists and engineers did gradually over decades rise to the top of universities, some of the corporate world, and were seen as problem solvers. And the ability to create, for young people to create new companies out of nowhere, it no longer was an old person's game when you've got young kids like, you know, starting these the dot-coms in the 90s and Facebook and that sort of thing. That's one way to really separate yourself, right? I can't go out, it's difficult to go out and prove myself in battle because there are not so many battles anymore. There are only so many slots in sports teams, et cetera. But anyone can get out there and try at their own company, et cetera. So I'm just thinking off the cuff.
Well, it's in a way, right? It's like it's some idea of like this pioneering mentality, right? Or like disrupting the hierarchy, but then recreating the hierarchy that you disrupted.
Yeah, social status matters, I think, a lot, and we don't know how to study that well.
Well, especially in societies without a social safety net, right?
Yes,
Yes. And then Camille.
We are talking about creative insecurity, but still it is insecurity. Do you think that this theory is sustainable? Like, how long nations can develop or innovate by fearing from each other? Like,
That's a similar question that Professor Long asked. How long does this play, especially since wars are sort of declining over the decades? I don't know. Do we start creating wars? Do we start just to do this? Or do we change our mentality about security or meaning? I don't know the answer to those questions. And again, I got to say, because I get the sense, I don't know how we're doing on time,
Yeah.
but I don't want people to walk out of the room thinking, oh, Professor Taylor thinks he's solved this whole problem. Not at all. What I want people to walk out of this room is thinking, okay, we used to think it's just domestic and it's just the right institution policies, but no, this is an problem with international solutions, and it's about networks as well, and there are these security aspects and the politics of manipulating that matter too. So hopefully I've sort of broadened your way of thinking about this innovation. I'm not saying this is the solution. I do think things like culture and luck and psychology matter. I haven't gotten there yet, maybe.
Yeah, Camille.
Have you written about, or did you talk about patents, you mentioned patents, legal regimes, and the role of maybe like antitrust enforcement? Because now with innovation, we saw these networks like Facebook or social networks, actual social networks, like Facebook and Google come along, and now they're massive and they're global, and there's potentially like, we don't know what innovation will look like in those spaces because they're so big. And now governments are starting to look at, whether those entities are harming competition. Can you talk a little bit more about like the role of legal regimes, trust?
So there is a whole industry of research on legal regimes and patents. I survey some of it in the book because patents can help innovation, but they can also hurt innovation. And there's this whole debate as to whether you really need them anymore or what good patents look like. So I can give you tons of citations, but it is not a good explanation overall. There are countries with terrible patent systems that innovate really well and countries with great patent systems that don't innovate that well at all. Italy is an example. They have a great patent system, but they're not especially innovative. And same with legal regimes. So I can give you there's citations in the book, and I'm happy to talk with you after if you want.
Any other questions or thoughts? I think this has been a really provocative, interesting discussion. Final thoughts, questions? All right, we have one, yes.
This is a good fun question. I'm guessing in the future, in my lifetime, we'll actually see the U.S. government, this is out of sci-fi, ban driving and like remove steering wheels, where all the cars will be self-driving. So my question to you, what do you think will be some technology you'll see in your lifetime that will really surprise you? In terms
I think the potential for virtual reality is, I don't know if it'll be revolutionary, but it'll be transformative. Has anyone tried VR before? Okay, if you haven't,
terrifying.
find a friend and try it.
Utterly terrifying.
It's amazing. There are implications for work, for training, for education, for all sorts of things, for art, for storytelling, for entertainment. And that if I could jump ahead 30 years and see what's being done, that's what I want to see. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, let's give
That's my personal thing.
a big round of applause to.
Thank you.
You want to put the book code back up there? I really enjoyed the book. I found myself, totally lost in it, missing subway stops. So thank you guys, and thanks for taking the time to have this really important, provocative discussion. Thank you.